from Académie Internationale de la Gastronomie and multisensory packaging design. He is a regular on TV and radio and has been profiled by the New Yorker, and today is with us. Hi Charles, can you hear us?
I can.
It's so good to have you again this year. You've been our guest last year, and we cannot wait to hear what's new in the field of gastrophysics, so I give the stage over to you.
Thank you. So it's a pleasure to be with you all virtually this afternoon. As you can see, a sunny afternoon for a change in Oxford. And in the time I have, I would like to tell you all about some of the latest things we've been working on and thinking about in the world of gastrophysics. And in a way, sort of taking things forward from what those of you who were there last year will have heard. Whether you can still remember is another thing. So last year I was talking very much about gastrophysics and about how it was possible to change people's experience of food and drinks by using sonic seasoning to make things taste sweeter or more bitter, using music also to bring out creaminess and sourness and spiciness, how lighting might make a wine seem fresher or fruitier. But in all these cases I mentioned, we're really taking flavor experiences, fruity, floral, meaty, creamy, sweet, sour, and so on, and kind of modifying them by doing something beyond the food, by changing the plate, the cutlery, the lighting, the music, and so on. But in all cases, we were just taking almost a mundane experience of sweetness, of fruitiness, and showing how we could be nudged by 10 or 15% in this direction or that. And in a way, one response to such findings might be, well, as a chef, maybe if I want to make things sweeter, why do I need to think about putting on a red light? Why not instead simply add a little bit more sugar for this sort of once in a lifetime experience in a fine dining restaurant? So today I want to move on and think about how to deliver sort of extraordinary experiences around food and drink, going beyond the everyday food encounter. And starting just with an example I finished off with at the end of last year when we were in the Estrella Dam brewery, thinking about these extraordinary experiences, extraordinary food experiences that might elicit awe, perhaps fear, disgust, that might bring us to tears, that might elicit a autonomous sensory meridian response, a kind of neck shiver, or that might be magical in some way. I think there are all manner of possible extraordinary food experiences, and I'm curious to see how the science of gastrophysics, when combined with the artistry of the kitchen, can help to deliver more of these extraordinary experiences. Next slide, please. And my sort of thinking in this space really started just by kind of anecdotal observations around this dish served at the Fat Duck in Bray, the sound of the seafood dish, the dish that comes to the table with the MP3 player playing the sounds of the sea that you can probably hear if I ask the next slide. And it comes to the table looking like the seashore with sand, foam, seaweed, and some sashimi. So this is an example of gastrophysics. It's using ambient sounds in a restaurant context to enhance the experience of food, to make people more attentive to the food, and hence they enjoy the taste of the seafood more. That's the result from research that we conducted here in Oxford with Heston Blumenthal and his team some years ago. But beyond that basic gastrophysics result, what's sort of amazing is how often people who have this dish are brought to tears, who cry. Now, crying is not something I normally do in front of a plate of seafood, but there seems to be something about people's experience with this particular dish that leads many journalists, people like Catherine DeLange, writing about her experience at the Fat Duck in the New Scientist magazine. She confesses she was brought to tears, couldn't explain why this dish did that to her, why it elicited this extraordinary response. Maybe it's about nostalgia, or bringing back childhood memories or emotion. Who knows? But something about the dish brought on tears. And just speaking to people casually who've been to the restaurant, many report this to be their favorite dish and will spontaneously say, I cried when I ate that plate of seafood. So what is going on? This is clearly an example of an extraordinary food experience. The question is, can we study it to figure out what is driving that response, and then perhaps incorporate it, assuming it's a good thing, into more of the dishes that we deliver. Next slide, please. One other example I'll give you of this extraordinary response to food and drink, this time from newspaper report from Sarah Napton, writing in the English press of her experience of the 2015 Campo Viejo Streets of Spain Colour Lab. We were there the year before, changing the taste of wine with red light and sweet music. In the following year, 2015, a synesthetic composer and sound artist, Nick Davis, I think is his name, had created 3 synesthetic soundtracks to match each of the 3 different Campo Viejo wines that members of the public could try. And on the press day for this event, Sarah Napton reports that she found herself crying with a glass of wine and some synesthetically matching music. Again, the same extraordinary response. And one thinks, what is going on here? And maybe it's something about both of the sound of the sea dish and the Campo Viejo example. People, consumers, diners, are thrown into an experience that initially they don't quite understand. There's a lot going on, things don't seem to make sense. Why are there earbuds with my seafood? Why am I listening to this soundtrack while tasting the wine? So initially you're kind of confused about what's this going on, all this sensory stimulation you cannot make sense of. But then at some point you kind of resolve the situation. You perhaps have an aesthetic aha moment, and it's that resolution of an uninterpretable situation that leads to kind of a release, and maybe that, in some cases at least, is what drives this extraordinary response mentioned in the restaurant and in experiential events. Of course, it's a response when people are brought to tears that I think the psychologists like myself have trouble dealing with, because we have ethics panels, and if our subjects cry, we get into all sorts of trouble. But in a restaurant context, I think it can be a positive and certainly a memorable experience, as evidenced by all those people who tell you how they cried years ago when faced with that plate of food and the sounds of the sea. Next slide, please. And this really sort of brings me back in a way to my very start in psychology as an undergraduate in the 1980s, reading through the journals and coming across another kind of extraordinary flavor experience. This time one that had been reported and documented by a psychologist working in Copenhagen. Kristen Holt Hansen was the name. So it's the end of the 60s, the early 70s. And he brings people into the lab, gives them a glass of Carlsberg beer, either Elephant Export Lager or the regular Carlsberg, and gets them to play with a tone generator to try and find the pitch of harmony, the pitch that matches the taste of each of those 2 beers. And what he finds is that people reliably pick a higher pitch for a more alcoholic beer. And then in a subsequent experiment, and these are the quotes from people who were there in the late 60s, early 70s, who were then given another glass of beer and presented with that matching, almost synesthetic sound of harmony. What did they experience? With just 1 glass of beer and a tone generator playing the matching sound, you see some amazing responses from people. We have one subject here saying, the tone turned into a tune. Thrills of pleasure ran through my body. I felt as if my head was expanding in all directions. My right hand with a glass of beer, and it trembled so violently that I was suddenly afraid of dropping the glass. I felt as if I was floating in the air. And so it goes on. This just with a glass of beer and a tone generator. These are clearly extraordinary responses again, so extraordinary that I think my colleagues in psychology and science have kind of neglected this paper ever since it was published. Maybe it's something about the 60s and the early 70s, drugs were on the scene, maybe who knows what our participants in this case were taking. But if we take this as true, then it does hint at the possibility of there being more extraordinary experiences that may have been documented, that may not have been, that are involve food and which could be brought out in a dining experience. That's the thing I'm looking for here. And the next slide, we have been working with Glenmorangie whiskey to try and deliver the extraordinary in a campaign going by the name of Sense the Extraordinary. And in this case, we were working with what has come to be known as the ASMR, the Autonomous Sensory Meridian Response. It's kind of the sort of shiver down the back of your neck that many people get when they hear somebody else whispering like this, or rattling paper like this. I don't get it much, but many people out there do. There are whole communities of ASMRers who find this electric neck shiver relaxing and who watch ASMR content online in order to help them relax before they go to sleep. ASMR, the name didn't exist 10 years ago. It feels like another sort of phenomenon that must have been around forever, but we just didn't realize it was there. But now the scientists, the psychologists, and the neuroscientists are studying ASMR, and we did an interview with lots of regular ASMRers online to ask them what triggered their electric neck shiver. Was it high-pitched sounds or low-pitched? Was it close-ups or far-away shots? Was it textured things or not? Did music work? If it was scripted, did it work or not? And we got back a whole series of insights about the triggers. Both high-pitched sounds and low-pitched sounds can trigger an ASMR response. Textured sounds seem to work pretty well. But anything that seemed too scripted, too deliberately trying to elicit this response, that was a turn-off for people. They didn't like it. And we took these results and then gave them to 3 video artists who then made audio-visual videos to be watched over closed-ear headphones to give you that sort of binaural sound around your head. And the idea was that people would taste the whiskey, one of the 3 versions of the whiskey, matching each of these 3 videos. And on the next slide, you can hopefully see a short segment from this. You may have to go to the next slide again to start. So here you can see a lot of very textured, close-up shots, playing with the sounds. And I think we were successful. This was certainly one of the most successful online marketing campaign that the company had ever run. And it's a whole new way, I think, of experiencing the whiskey. And by pairing this neck shiver with the taste of the drink, I think that's another way to deliver the extraordinary tasting experience that we were after. And Glenmorangie are certainly not the only ones in this space. A number of other food companies, from Japanese chocolate makers to IKEA, I think even, have been trying to elicit ASMR in their customers. But I've yet to see this being translated into the restaurant setting. Could you have an ASMR dish? And does it matter that there's only a subset of the population who experience this particular extraordinary response, in this case, paired with food? Can I have my next slide, please? But now I want to shift a bit to thinking about another kind of extraordinary food experience, and that relates to magic, a magical food experience. Sounds like it would be extraordinary. And certainly the kind of the metaphor that many of us use for talking about magic, the idea of pulling a rabbit out of a hat, sounds like something that ought to be chef-friendly. Rabbits are kind of a reasonably sustainable, tasty ingredient to use. And if we take this definition of what is it, what is magic from the North American magician Teller. He says that magic is all about the unwilling suspension of disbelief. You experience as real and unreal at the same time. Magic goes straight to the brain, and that's what I study as a psychologist, the brain of diners and drinkers. Its essence is intellectual. And to the extent that last year I was suggesting that the pleasures of the table also reside primarily in the mind and not the mouth, that would seem a certain sort of synergy or parallel between magic and food. And so for the last couple of years, we've been working with chefs, people like Joseph Youssef from Kitchen Theory in North London, with his Gastrophysics chef's table, with magicians and psychologists like Gustav Kuhn, trying to both look at examples from the past of where magic and flavor have come together, and then try and construct new experiences to deliver on this, the promise of eating magic, which is more than just magic happening while you're eating or magic happening next to the food you eat. There's something more involved. And I want to take you through a few examples of what I see happening and having happened in this space, and think about some of the difficulties potentially involved. And I want to start with the next slide as one example from our own work here in Oxford with Chef Charles Michel on what's called the butcher's tongue illusion. And we have yet to find a chef interested in putting this on the menu, but it works great in the science lab. And we have even had members of the magic circle trying this illusion and going, that's real magic. The basic idea is to follow what the cat is doing, to stick your tongue out in front of you, like so. But you have your face in a box, and in this box, it lies a butcher's tongue, a beef tongue, for example, and a mirror. So you cannot see your own tongue when it sticks out, but you can see the butcher's tongue in the box via the mirror. And then we come along and simultaneously stroke your tongue out of sight, the butcher's tongue in the box. And within a few seconds, the majority of people have the illusion that the butcher's tongue they can see being stroked in the box is their own tongue. And hence, when we drop some lemon juice, squeeze some lemon juice onto the butcher's tongue, some people actually experience the acidity on their own tongue, even though we've put no lemon juice there. So this is sort of magic in, around the mouth, tasting outside the mouth, which I think is a very interesting concept, but one that is a bit too fiddly, I think, perhaps for that restaurant setting. But still, it's out there, should you be interested. In my next slide, I think we've also been looking back. Can we have the next slide? We've also been looking back in the history to say, given how much people like food, how much they like drink, and how much they like magic, you might imagine these things have come together before. And yet, there is surprisingly little magic that involves food, from my reading of the literature and from my talk with various magicians. It almost seems as if most magic is a visual thing. Can you think of an auditory magic trick? Most of it's sleights of hands, things that you see, and perhaps it's the visual dominance of magic that makes it less amenable to the world of taste, perhaps. Or perhaps magic is a kind of trickery, it's a kind of, I don't understand what's going on, and hence while we might enjoy magic happening outside of us, where it can't harm us, as soon as something goes into our mouth, if magic happens in here, that could be scary, it could be poisonous, I don't know what I'm eating, maybe that's just fundamentally not nice. But anyway, those who have, the very few magicians who have brought an element of food to their magic are people like the character you can see here from, I think, the late 1690s, early 1700s and onwards. We have the kind of bottle trick. Here, the great wizard of the north of England, where I grew up, pouring from a bottle one of a range of different drinks. And you can see from the cutaway on the right of the slide how this bottle actually contains 3 or 4 different canisters. And by changing where the magician puts their finger, they can release one or other of those bottles. And hence it appears that I can get many different drinks from the same bottle simply by a sleight of the hand. On the next slide, you can probably see the bottle again with the holes shown just about on the left. And this sort of, the never-ending bottle type trick has reappeared over the years in various forms. On the right of the slide here, we see David Devant, 1905, magician performing in London to an adoring audience, it seems, from the bottom of the slide. His magic trick, the obliging kettle. Again, many different drinks from the same kettle, using the same principle, I think. Or if you have time to go online, then one can think of Think a Drink Hoffman, as he was known, the highest paid barman in Prohibition era America, who had a version of the same trick as well, asking the audience, what would you like to drink? And then serving them whatever they wanted, milk or brandy or coffee or cola, all from the same container, and again, using the same sort of sleight of hand, I think. So here we see that on very rare occasion, magicians have played with food, have incorporated food, but mostly it seems only to have been drinks rather than solid foods. And in the next slide, we can see that sort of idea carried through, that when we look in the contemporary landscape, have the next slide, please, then one tends to see magic and flavor coming together more often in the context of the bar world, molecular modernist mixology, if you will, than perhaps in food. So here we have one example of a kind of illusion, a magic-themed cocktail menu from the Bar Paradiso in Barcelona, from I think 2018, 2019 season. And if we go on to the next slide, we can see a report, journalist report of what goes on here. They say, Paradiso, it isn't a bar, it's a Broadway show. Take a bow, the illusionist menu. Housed in vessels, if we can call them that, bespoke made by local craftspeople. Some cocktails change color, others transition from sweet to bitter. There are those that are guillotined in half in front of you, and others that you can't even find. But if drinks in Trojan horses aren't your thing, go for the classic twist, super cool martini. Made using a proprietary technique, the mixing of the liquids sees an iceberg freeze in the glass. Just another bit of the unexpected from the Paradiso box of tricks. So here we are seeing sort of magic at the bar in the service and consumption and performance, as it were, of drinks. And that, I think I see a few other magical, illusionary bar menus popping up over the last year or two, seemingly to great success. This Bar Paradiso, I think, coming in as one of the world's top 50 bars. But if I go to the next slide, what I also see is that from talking to mixologists is that they're not all happy about the idea of searching for extraordinary flavor experiences through magic. And the reason is they think it's sort of too silly, too childish. It kind of devalues the serious art of what they're trying to create. It's all a bit Harry Potter, in the words of one mixologist, referencing the fact that there are Harry Potter themed bars in London and in New York. This from the Hudson Hotel, I think, in New York. Harry Potter themed cocktails that, of course, will change color, that are served in cauldrons and so on. And it's sort of theatrical, playful, yes, but almost a bit childish and not serious enough is the worry. I'm not sure if that's true of many mixologists, but certainly some of that view. We don't want magic with our drinks. Ours is a much more serious undertaking. If we go to the next slide then, and say magic is being combined, at least on occasion, with drinks. What about the world of food? And perhaps the first example I come across of food being combined with magic, albeit unsuccessfully, comes from the late 90s, when David Copperfield was in discussion, at least, with Disney to create a series of themed magic underground restaurants where you'd have lots of food to eat, but also lots of magic being performed in and around the diners. I'm not quite sure why. It never quite came to pass, but had this been successful, this would have been perhaps the first magical food experience since perhaps the feeding of the 5,000 in the Bible, which is a kind of magical food experience, one might say. But moving on to the next slide, we do see that David Copperfield did return, or his influence returned, a couple of decades later, because he was one of the magicians who were advising 11 Madison Park when they, a few years ago, decided to incorporate a number of magic card tricks that were, I think, of the place, that were performed on the street in New York into their meal service. So it's presumably great magic. It's happening at the table. If you go forward next, please. Both in this case and in the case of what is known as Chicago bar magic from the time of Al Capone, where magic tricks would be performed at the bar when you ordered and you consumed your drink in North America. In both of these cases, there's magic and there's food and there's drink, but they're in the same place, but you're not eating the magic. You see the magic trick and then you have the nice thing to eat. So magic and food and drink are coming closer together, but you're not doing what I want to pursue, actually eating magic. We're getting close, maybe. Thinking about the next slide, then what other ways you might think about sort of magical food experiences, actually eating some kind of magic. Things that came to my mind, at least, were kind of the medieval trend to sew the front of one animal onto the back quarters of a different animal. Or again, the medieval sort of courtly dining spectacle where live chickens would emerge out of the innards of a cooked dead animal, as if almost coming back to life. Here in this slide, we can see, I guess, a turkey and a pig, which becomes a perky, I think, but an animal that does not exist. So a kind of mythical, almost magical creature that can then be consumed, and that is sort of, in some places at least, kind of trendy today, but has a reference for several hundred years ago. And on the next slide, we see one of the other people who are thinking about these kind of magical, mythical beasts, things that you might consume that do not exist and you have no idea where they came from. The wonderful Dutch designer Marija Wolfgang, as best I could pronounce it, and she did some work creating kind of meats from mythical creatures. You can see these sort of drumsticks here of some animal, and in the next slide, you can see how she sort of packages these mythical, magical meats. She has the kind of turkey that lives only inside the volcanoes of Southeast Asia, something else called a herbast. Just thinking about the packaging, the design, the presentation, we're sort of creating these myth stories around these unknown animals. And I think she's doing this she's not doing this with magic in mind, but nevertheless, eating a mythical creature, I think, can be considered as kind of magical. So on to the next slide, please. I'll leave it there and now think about sort of the magic serve, when food and magic get closer together. And there have been a few examples that perked up our interest, at least. One popular approach has been what you see in the three examples laid out here, kind of the levitating food. We have from Bar Artesian on the top left, they're kind of one of their levitating cocktails from a few years ago. we have the sort of floating counting sheep or going to sleep dish from the fat duck shown on the right again. How is that pillow magically levitating and spinning in the air? And a version from the English chef I worked closely with, Joseph Youssef, of levitating Guinness ice cream, I think, from an event that we did in Dublin a few years ago. So they're all using the technology, and it's sort of magical the first time you come across it. But I think all diners can sort of understand, I don't know how it's done, but I know where it's done. I know there must be something, magnets or something, inside the cup or the box or the plate to make these things sort of float. So while the precise mechanism isn't understood, hence it's kind of magical, still you kind of know where to look for the magic, as it were. It's there in the technology of the dish rather than somewhere else. For the next slide, then I think there are sort of other ways or places you might think about magic in the food that we eat. And I guess a number of the examples of modernist or molecular gastronomy, however you want to call it, when ingredients and dishes are taken apart and recombined, colors and tastes and flavors and textures in a whole new ways, that I presume is magical to many diners, such as this dish you see here, entirely white, I think created by the El Bulli team, but then served at El Sala de Can Roca, as far as my history tells me, but a dish of all white, different textures, and yet it delivers intense flavors through distillation, or coffee, of cinnamon, citrus, and cocoa, and so on. And here for the diner, how on earth did they do that? There is mystery again. It's almost magical. I don't know how they did it, but I think again, diners who think about this would say, this is magical, but the magic happened in the kitchen, magic of preparation. So I know where to look for the misdirect, and so on. And I want a situation where the diner doesn't have the faintest idea where the magic came from. And we'll get to that hopefully in the end. In the next slide, we see another dish that could be considered magical, I think. The nitro frozen bacon and egg ice cream as served at the Fat Duck Tableside, where seemingly raw eggs are cracked into a pan and without the application of fire or heat, the ice cream is made, leaving diners perplexed and worried as to whether they might get salmonella or something else from eating these uncooked raw eggs, when in fact the sleight of hand has been to make a little needle hole in the eggs, extract the contents, process them, and then refill the eggs before they're cracked at table. So that's kind of magical at the table side too, and that is perhaps a contender for real magic at the table. As I think I've come across Albert Adria, apparently in his Chef's Table episode, also serves a bit of magic tableside, but only for select children diners, I think. A dish where random ingredients are thrown together and then the cloche is lifted and a finished dish is revealed for the diner. But as I say, I think that's not on the regular menu as such, but is a kind of magic at table. For the next slide, we have 4 other perhaps stronger contenders. On top left, we have the oyster leaf, which again is nothing magical about it if you know that these leaves are sourced from the shores of Scotland, and they do naturally taste of oysters. And yet, in a modernist dining context, it can be magical for the diner who does not know how on earth did they make this leaf that looks like a sage leaf taste just like the sea. Top right, we have a nice example from my colleague Denis Martin, 2 Michelin star chef in Vevey in Switzerland. His dish rien, or nothing, a dish that comes to the table with a kind of a bit of humor. The jug you see pouring nothing into a bowl, and you're told to eat nothing. But of course, the flavor has been applied to the surface of the spoon. So you get the flavor that way. Bottom left, we have the hot and cold tea, again served at the Fat Duck. And there's another example where diners left mystified. How can a drink of tea be hot when I sip it from one side and cold from the other side? They're not able to perceive kind of the finely chopped gel that helps keep the hot and cold side of this drink separated. So again, magical. And finally, on the bottom right, a dish I've never tried myself, but from the reports of those who did, the rattle from Mugaritz in San Sebastian describe it as kind of an amuse-bouche that you'd pick up in your hand and sort of shake, and it'd make a noise like a rattle, and then diners would eat this, and then there'd be nothing inside that could have made that rattling sound. And by the time you put it in your mouth, it's kind of too late to go back and pull it all apart. You've eaten it. So the magic has disappeared without you being able to figure out. And for people who had that dish, they said that was also magical. How on earth did they do that? And they're still mystified years later as to the source of what was going on. On the next slide, we have, sorry, back one. We have just an example from contemporary magician who has been working and advising the fat duck over the years on creation of dishes that will burst into flames when you clip your fingers. Darren Brown, very popular mentalist, from one of his stage shows, showing where he gets a light bulb, smashes it, and then feeds a piece to the scared looking participant, audience member on stage, you can see left. Together with Joseph Youssef, in the next slide, we've been working on, he's been working on a version of this for his restaurant, Chef's Table, a electric light bulb that you can illuminated, a whole series of them on a kind of chandelier that are then smashed on the table as if by accident in front of the diners for dessert, and they are then encouraged to pick up the pieces and to eat them, as shown in the next slide. And in this case, people are sort of nervous about what's going on. Of course, it is nothing more complicated than spun sugar. It has the appearance of glass, but nevertheless, I think kind of an effective, it's almost like magic to be eating a light bulb without starting to bleed. And a popular dish, I think, amongst the diners. And so a nice example where something that started as a magic trick on the stage has then been translated into a successful dish in the restaurant. I should say this work on the magical tasting experiences so outrageous apparently that my colleagues in the International Journal of Food Gastronomy refused to publish these things I'm telling you about. But fortunately, you can find more examples and more detail from a paper published open access in Flavor earlier this year. So to finish off, I just want to give a few examples of another kind of an extraordinary food experience, one around transformation. For the next slide, we'll hopefully see one currently sort of popular example on the internet you see from the Far East of the octopus apparently coming back to life, reanimated, a food in transformation through the application of the sauce you see there. I think it's the salt in the sauce that then whatever does the thing to the muscles. So it seems magical. How can you bring an animal back to life? It's clearly an example of gastroporn and kind of a food in transition that I think could be interesting. Because after all, we all like fresh things, but why do we not like things that are still living? In the next slide, I think this interest in food in transition. It could be food that is dynamic, food that appears to move or to breathe. But it could also be food that changes color. And this is something that if you go back to ancient Roman times, then you find reports of the fancy dinner parties where the surmullet would be brought out from the kitchens and paraded around in front of the dinner guests. And it would go through a rainbow array of different colors. So this is color changing food, gastroporn in ancient Rome, as it were, through transformation of color. And that idea of color transformation is one that has become very popular recently with, in the next slide, for example, we can see the Yum Cha Blue Voodoo tea, one of a number of products. Starbucks has one as well, of color changing drinks using pea flour and acid. So a drink that initially comes out looking blue with the application of a squeeze of lemon, changes the pH and the color. And this was sold out on its original release. And that idea of color changing food seems to have captured public interest. In the next slide, we see an example of that color change, but now in the world of food and gastronomy. This from the magic noodle salad, using the same approach, served at a Thai restaurant in the Macaron Hotel in New York. The noodles change color, they contain the pea flour, and you can see the acidic lime being applied there. The next slide, we've got a couple of other examples of color changing foods using a different sort of approach. This from the chameleon ice cream, I think from the Basque country, from Manuel Linares, kind of the color changing ice cream whose color changes as a result of the warmth of your tongue against the ice cream and the contents of your saliva. Kind of great to see this food change its color as I lick it. But in this, as in the next example of a bioluminescent dish that is served at Jose Lucas Perez Lloren's restaurant, both I think using elements of seaweeds and things from down there to give rise to these electrifying colors. In both of these cases, it's a great example, but I think it turns out to be too expensive to kind of serve this kind of technology or color change at scale. I think the ice creams were hundreds of pounds a scoop when I looked. And the chef here with this dish says, it's for demonstration purposes, but can't be done at scale yet. And I think in both cases that the magic is happening in the food itself. You don't understand the chemistry, the technology of the food, but you know it's happening in the food. Just my last couple of examples, moving on to the next slide. Other ways of using technology now to change the appearance of food. One I showed, I think last year, is our augmented reality sushi. Diners seeing the sushi on the left, but with a headset on, shown in the middle of the screen, we can change the apparent sushi fish in real time without meta cookies on the fish. And this is work coming out of Katsuo Okajima's lab in Japan, done both with sushi. And in the bottom, the video doesn't work, but he's got an amazing demonstration where he can add virtual cream to a black cup of coffee. You can shake it in your hand. You can see the ripples on the surface of the coffee. And just with a flick of a switch on the computer, you can add as much cream as you want. And this is amazing technology to really change the color and appearance of food. And yet, you can see with the headset, I think diners, this hasn't really been used in restaurants yet, as far as I can tell. And the problem is the diner kind of knows where the magic is happening. If I'm putting this thing on my head, then it's clear that that is where the transformation is happening. So it's sort of magical, but again, I can nail where the magic's coming from, and I want something a bit more. And the last two examples here, the next slide is one potential way in that we've been working on, and this from a new-ish illusion that was published by my colleague Manuel Spitzchan here in Oxford, called the neon fruit illusion. And you can sort of see from the chilies shown there that if you have a row of chilies on the table, then simply by changing the lighting, by using kind of different but matching illumination profiles, you can actually make food flicker and glow as if neon bright. And in this case, because the lighting doesn't seem to change, it's very hard for people to know, where does this illusion come from? Why is that chili suddenly flashing on and off? I can't see anything happening. Is it in the chili? Is it in the lighting? People don't know. And we've been working with Chef Joseph, not successfully so far, in something in this space of having a dish that magically transforms without the diner knowing how that was possibly done. And my final example on the next slide, and this does not exist yet, but appeared as a coda in an article that I published last year on the changing color of food and drink, which is to take another example from the science labs, the idea of slow change blindness. And you can see the two still images on the left and right at the bottom of the slide. And if you go online to the website and just type in a slow color change blindness illusion, you find lots of examples on YouTube of videos that kind of run for about 45 seconds And during that time, the colors in the scene change. But when changes happen in our visual world very slowly, we don't pick them up. We only pick up transient, sudden changes. So my hope is we could use this illusion somehow. If we could serve people, say, 3 drinks, one red, one green, one blue. I ask you, which would you like? I tell you nothing about the flavor, so you have to pick based on color. The diners each pick a different colored drink. I go away, and then a minute later I come back, and all of those drinks will have changed color, but done so slowly that people won't realize. And in this case, you have a sort of lot of fun about the reveal. Well, aren't you drinking that person's drink? Because you said you wanted red, and you're actually drinking the green drink now, which is what they were having. And in this case, I'm hopeful that the diners would have no idea what has gone on. They would not know whether it's a slow color-changing chemical reaction in the food itself. They would not know if it's something to do with the lighting. They would not know if nothing changed at all, but this is just a mentalist trick like Derren Brown uses, just to fool you into thinking something wasn't in fact true. And this would be a truly magical sort of experience because you would have no idea how it was done. As I say, the dish does not exist as yet, but I think there is scope to deliver more of these extraordinary food experiences that make us cry, that are memorable, that maybe give us a neck shiver, that may induce awe, that may be magically, mystically surprising. And by doing so, we can hopefully ensure that gastrophysics and multisensory dining are even more enjoyable than they are already today. With that, I will finish with the next slide, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for letting us in this world of gastrophysics. What, in your opinion, will be the future of the gastrophysics? Do you see any patterns, any paths for the development, apart from what you've told us already?
Yep. So I guess one thing that's very concerning at the moment is how the current pandemic will affect not just how we run our conferences, virtually rather than in person, but also the kind of food experiences that we have. So they're sort of very interested in how the kind of the rise of digital commensality of people at a distance but having a cocktail party together, even though they're in different places over Zoom or Skype or something else. So I'm very interested in that sort of notion of how we maintain the social aspects of drinking and dining at a distance through technology. And also I'm sort of interested to see whether, as the world suddenly becomes a lot more dangerous, a less secure place, does that then lead to a change in the sorts of food experiences people will search out? And that maybe, the molecular, the modernist, the surprising, the shocking of dining, that is something that we enjoy when the world seems good. And when the world seems dangerous, scary, unknown, is that the time when we then regress, if that's the word, to more comfort foods, to sort of familiar foods, to familiar brands, and kind of veer away from the more experimental in food? I'm not sure that will happen, but I imagine it might. And some of the kind of the already emerging patterns seem to suggest that's the case. But on the good side, I think, we've been working on a few projects about how to kind of connect people digitally at a distance around food and drink. So I think there are challenges, but also opportunities there to deliver enhanced emotional connection and engagement through technology around those kind of food and drink experiences that in normal times would so often be kind of the bonding, be it in the home or out on a social occasion.